So as I was saying, once the sites were found, we would then record them. We would fill out a site sheet that I'm sure many of you who have worked with us are familiar with, and containing information on all the levels of motifs, from the types of all the levels of information, from the types of motifs on the rock, the number of motifs, to the type of rocks in which they were carved, and also the landscape setting. So we would measure the rocks, the motifs. We would identify the degree of inclination of the panels and the type of grains, for instance, that compose the geological matrix of the rocks. We would identify other types of archaeological sites nearby, and so on. So there was lots of information that we were gathering at this point. In addition, we also recorded the rock art photographically, and we captured pictures from different angles and details of the motifs. But we also produced 3D models of all of the recorded panels, and you can find these models and explore them in our Sketchfab accounts, where they are all available. So the digital recording of rock art has become a generalized practice in recent years because it's relatively simple to develop and allows for the documentation of whole panels, as you can see in the example on the bottom left of your screen. But when the models have enough resolution, it also allows us to scrutinize very, very small details of the motifs, like the ones you can see on the right-hand side. So these digital methods are a lot less subjective than previous traditional recording techniques, and they're also less intrusive, so there is less damage to the rock while we're doing it. And so with this technique, we have been able to observe details that we were previously unaware of. For example, we have been identifying a number of superimpositions in panels with Atlantic rock art motifs, whereas we previously thought that this tradition, unlike others, did not have these overlapping images. So for our work, we used mostly structure from motion photogrammetry, which consists in the capture of a sequence of overlapping photographs. And we then process these images with a dedicated software. In our case, we're using Egisoft Metashape, which is a paid program, but there are other free options out there. And so the software identifies the overlapping parts of each photograph. It stitches together all the images and then creates this triangulation that replicates the relief of what was being modeled. So the rock texture and surface in this case. So Kilmartin was one of the first targeted areas for our field work, and we started here in the summer of 2018 with a field school with students from the University of Edinburgh, which was then followed by another field school in the summer of 2019. The field schools comprised mostly undergraduate and postgraduate students, mainly from the University of Edinburgh, but also from Glasgow, and there was also one from America. And they were hugely supported by Kilmartin Museum, who provided office space, use of library for presentations. They took the students on tours across Kilmartin monuments and made the experience so much better. And also in the first year, the students worked alongside the local Kilmartin team while we were conducting some training. The Kilmartin team, which was led by Julia Hamilton, who you probably know, Education Officer for Kilmartin Museum, and the team recorded many of the panels that were not covered by any of the field schools or by any work developed by the scrap staff, including the very large Ardafew 12 Dragon Rock. And if you're interested in the work carried out by Kilmartin team, and more specifically this really beautiful Dragon Rock, then you can go on YouTube to hear Julia, Will, and Margaret Rudd talk about this in a presentation which was delivered last April to our scrap conference. And I really recommend the talk. It's very good, and it has a lot of detail about the work that they were doing in the field. So I'm going to now pass on to Linda.
Yes, so I will introduce a bit more about the data analysis that me and Joanna have been conducting since I started in Scrap. So in the Kilmartin area, there are about 332 rock art panels in the wider area, of which 229 have been recorded and validated by Scrap. The analysis and research that we will be talking about today was developed with this data that has been recorded in the field. Because the data set is so extensive and we are looking at the data in quite a lot of detail, we have defined two Kilmartin study areas. So one is focused on the Kilmartin Glen and the other one on the Kilmickle Glaciary area. The two areas combined consist of 91 panels, which is just over 40% of the validated data in this area. So we're covering quite a bit of ground here. And next. Given the unprecedented detailed data set that we have been able to gather during this project, we are in quite a good position now to investigate Scotland's rock art in a lot of detail, so allowing us to address old questions but also raise new questions. So we established four main research questions at the beginning of the project. Firstly, we wanted to know when prehistoric rock art was created in Scotland and how it changed over time. Secondly, we wanted to know what the main characteristics of the rock art are. Thirdly, we have also been working to understand the striking differences in the distribution patterns. Why is it so uneven, with some areas having high concentration of rock art and others having far less? And finally, we are also interested to know who created the rock art and what it was for. All these questions are very interlinked and also very difficult to answer, mostly due to the nature of the rock art itself. So we will address some of these in relation to Kilmartin today. Next one. Yeah. Our approach is based on a three-scale methodology, which when combined allows us to look at the rock art as a whole. So we have the small scale analysis, which focuses on the morphology of the motifs and the very small details, as well as carving techniques. At the next level, the medium scale, the rocks are classified according to the physical characteristics of the rock media, the interaction between motifs and also natural features of the rocks, as well as compositions of motifs, how they are organized on the rock surface and organized amongst themselves. And finally, at the large scale, we are looking at patterns of landscape setting, for example, the relationship between the rock art and natural elements, as well as contemporary monuments that surround the rock art. We will be looking at the landscape, or we will begin with the landscape, since this is such a defining element of Atlantic rock art, primarily because it's located in open air contexts. We know that deciding where to carve would potentially be the first step in the creation of rock art, even if ultimately the motifs were the carrying message. So to better understand this relationship between the rock art and landscape, we looked at a number of natural elements that may have been important in the moment of deciding where to create the motifs. For example, the local geology could have been important, since rocks may have different levels of hardness and be more or less appropriate for this practice. They could be more or less shiny or appealing in other ways. The inclination of the terrain in which the panels are located can also have implications in how accessible they are, which would then determine the number of people that could gather around the rocks, and also the orientation of the places or aspect where the panels are located could play an important role if people were supposed to look over specific natural features or other contemporary sites. Similarly, previous research has assumed that a wide visibility over the surrounding landscape is a defining feature for the location of rock art, as well as visibility from the landscape towards the panels and also intervisibility between carvings. It has also been assumed that the rock art is related to routeways and patterns of mobility across the landscape. So in our research, we set out to confirm or dispel some of these assumptions using a range of computational modeling techniques that help us to quantify and demonstrate our conclusions in a scientific way. So this includes using geographic information systems, or GIS. GIS allows you to create, manage, analyze, and map all sorts of data, and you can also look at a number of landscape features, patterns, and spatial relationships. Some of the variables that are giving us some striking results are the aspect, which is the orientation of the slope, and the slope itself, which looks at the degree or inclination of the terrain. Very consistently, we are finding that a large number of rock art panels are located in south-facing slopes, sometimes with some variations towards east or west, but hardly ever facing north. And this trend, which you can see in Kilmartin 1 and 2 on the graph on the left, is also extended to the whole country. We are now thinking that this choice is certainly deliberate. We believe that this preference is related to the type of sunlight that sheds on the southern slopes, which would make the rock art more visible at certain times of the day, or even have special effects in specific periods of the year. In addition, southern slopes often receive more solar exposure, which would affect the vegetation, and thus the prominence of the rock art in the landscape. This changes how people would potentially perceive the panels, considering that so many of them are low-lying and flat. The inclination of the terrain also provides information that may be relevant to our understanding of rock art, since it has implications on the types of activities that can be carried out in the different parts of the landscape. In general, it is considered that optimal arable farming locations fall within 0 to 12% of inclination, and slopes that are greater than 20% would only be suitable for grazing and forestry practices. So it is interesting to see that the majority of panels fall between in the medium category with a percentage of 5 to 15% inclination. This opens up possibilities for types of activities that could have been carried out in the surroundings of the rock art in Kilmartin. Because visibility has been deemed so important in rock art studies, we have been looking at it in detail from various perspectives. So Joana already mentioned Professor Richard Bradley. He really pioneered the study of rock art through landscape archaeology, giving much importance to visibility, a trend that has since then been extensively adopted. In fact, one of the first applications of visibility studies using GIS, the so-called viewshed analysis, was developed in Kilmartin by Professor Vincent Gaffney to test Bradley's assumptions regarding the importance of visibility in relation to rock art location. And just to mention quickly, a viewshed analysis essentially allows you to determine the extent of the terrain that is visible from a specific point. The map that you see on your left shows the calculation of a cumulative viewshed. This is the sum of all the single viewsheds created for each panel on their own. So we can see that the dark blue areas are simultaneously visible by or less 5 sites, whereas the yellow areas are visible from 27 to 45 sites. So areas of high visual prominence can indicate particularly important landmarks, for instance. The model is showing that due to the nature of the topography, the visibility is very much limited to the narrow glens and valley floors. So very much the Kilmartin Glen, the Kilmichael Glen, and the Moynemore Bogland to the south. The extensive and far-reaching views seem to be restricted to a selected few sites, in particular coastal panels such as Ormaig. At a smaller scale, many panels appear to actually be visually isolated. The direction of visibility is obviously largely determined by the landscape, but how does that relate to movement through the landscape? The viewshed may highlight areas of accessibility, routes, and perhaps also navigational markers. We have combined all the information we have about the rock art, about visibility, mobility, and also contemporary archaeological evidence to look for correlation. I want to also quickly zoom in on the northern part of the Kilmartin Glen. On the next slide. So here we calculated intervisibility using a 500-meter radius and an observer height of 1.6 meters, which is considered to be an acceptable generic height for individuals in the past. So the count or the number that you see next to each site refers to how many times that panel is being seen by another panel. Now, the most striking observation is perhaps the connection between 4 panels in a row. The first one starts at the valley floor, and each one is located at a slightly higher elevation until you reach the last panel. There is almost a transition from the lowland area up to the upland area. I mentioned earlier how rock art has been associated with paths and boundary markers. Our cone of vision tends to be more limited if we're looking up a slope than looking down a slope due to the natural gradients of the terrain. So this line does not necessarily indicate which direction the visibility points to, but a closer look at the pairs reveals that the visibility is actually moving down the slope. So Craigentariff cannot see Carnassery Farm 11, but Carnassery Farm 11 can see Craigentariff, and so forth going up the hill. This one directional line of sight could indicate a particular movement of visibility that is related to these specific locations. However, this line of sight is not captured at smaller scales of 100 meters or 50 meters. So these sites do not seem to have been intervisible at an intimate level, but perhaps they testify to another type of visual relationship. So a closer look at these 4 rocks in the field show that they are relatively flush with the ground. They are between 20 centimeters and 60 centimeters in height, apart from number 4. And despite being located in an open air context, they almost appear tucked away, and all panels except the last boulder were covered by turf and vegetation. This is significant because it impacts their visual prominence in the landscape. We can speculate that if they were made to be seen from above, what purpose does that serve? And is it significant? These are hard and perhaps impossible questions to answer, but it does demonstrate that there's more to visibility than simply to see and to be seen. As well as visibility, rock art has often been associated with potential patterns of mobility or routeways that cross the landscape, and therefore interpreted as landscape markers or elements to organize movement. This was largely based on the observation of rock art sites near modern pathways that may have well been used since very old times. However, it is difficult to demonstrate a clear association between rock art and paths, and we also need to remember that routes and pathways would have been highly variable in the past. We use different computational approaches to simulate mobility patterns. Unfortunately, I won't be going into much technical details about this, but happy to answer any questions later on. The picture on the right shows one of the mobility networks that we have generated, taking into account the characteristics of the terrain. These paths were generated between random points, which you see as red dots on the map. And this approach really helped us to understand how people may have potentially moved across the landscape. We then examined how rock art, contemporary funerary monuments, and standing stones compare spatially to this network of paths. This can be determined through the popularity of their location. In other words, how often a path in this network crosses a point in the landscape. The results showed that the relation between the mobility network and rock art was actually quite random. This means that the rock art location was most likely not influenced by the paths. This is a significant observation because it challenges the idea that rock art is associated with pathways. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. Rock art is often located in areas that are less likely to be traveled. One of the densest routeways identified in our analysis, and therefore one of the most popular ones, stretches across the ridges on the western side of the Kilmartin Glen. Some of the Ormeig panels fall within this area. Described sometimes as being one of the most isolated rock art sites in Scotland, it is interesting to think that perhaps in the prehistoric landscape, Ormeig may have been one of the more frequently encountered rock art sites. In terms of the standing stones, they show more intentionality in relation to the paths in both case study areas. Standing stones are accompanying routeways. So, for example, in the Kilmartin 2 area, the standing stones at Old Poltalloch, Carnassery, and Craigentaragh, they follow an eastern-western alignment. Standing stones tend to therefore be located in more popular areas than the rock art. The statistical tests also show that the relationship between standing stones and paths is not random and therefore most likely not caused by chance. This is interesting because it shows how rock art and standing stones, which were presumably contemporary monuments, were located in different areas of the landscapes. It seems that standing stones were far more suited to be navigational markers than rock art. And interestingly, this is even more so the case for funerary monuments such as chambered cairns. They have the highest popularity scores compared to rock art and standing stones. There seems to be a much stronger relation between funerary monuments and paths, which is not random. It is interesting that we are seeing very clear differences in how rock art, funerary monuments, and standing stones in Kilmartin relate to this network of paths. This could potentially relate to different modes of perception. Perhaps funerary monuments were meant to be encountered more frequently than, for example, rock art. Or perhaps their varying popularity also symbolizes a very specific structuring of the landscape.
Thank you, Linda. So I will now take it from here, and we are now moving to a different scale of analysis. So we'll be looking at the medium scale. This scale of analysis relates to the type of rocks that were chosen to carve. So whether they would be outcrops or boulders, but also the relationships between the motifs that were carved on these rocks and the textures of the rock surface, as well as other natural features. In fact, we know that Atlantic rock art was had a very close relationship with the natural features of the rocks, and we see this interaction between the motifs and these natural elements very often. So the edges of the rocks, the fissures and solution holes were often incorporated into the compositions or even transformed into motifs. So you can see some of these examples on the pictures on the screen. In addition, this type of rock art is also very plastic, often displaying a three-dimensional aspect to it. And this would only be achieved by using a certain type of rock with the right lumps and bumps. So you can see on the right bottom of your screen, you can see how those motifs are actually embracing that lump on the rock. So we were looking at the rock art type, the rock type, the geological features, the textures and colors, and as I said, how the carvings were interacting with this natural dimension of the media. We analyzed the structure of the compositions as well, in terms of the motifs that were depicted, the frequency of the motifs, and the arrangements between them, and the relationships between the different types of motifs that were being carved on the rocks. So the study of this scale of analysis revealed that in Kilmartin specifically, there is a preference for outcrops, although of course there are many examples of carved boulders. There are a number of very complex panels, as you know, some of which are the best known examples of prehistoric rock art in Scotland, such as Ormeig, Achnabreg, Cairnban, or Torvlaren. But the majority of panels are actually composed of cup marks or cup and rings in simple compositions, often being depicted in isolation or on the rock surface, or with just a few number of motifs on the same panel. The rocks tend to be quite discrete, because of the motifs that are carved, because of the types of rocks that are selected, which are mostly small to medium sizes, and also because of the landscape, where they are located in the landscape. And considering how they are positioned in these low-lying locations and the changing vegetation, they were probably not visible at all sometimes, because they would have been covered, they were quite small. So as Linda was suggesting earlier, with our visibility studies, they do seem to be quite private in a way, although they are located out in a landscape. And also, following other examples of Atlantic rock art, there are many cases of deep engagements of the motifs with the rock surface, where the fissures and the panel edges are considered and were integrated into these compositions, as you can see on your screen, some of these examples. So finally, the smallest scale of analysis in our methodology refers to the study of the motifs themselves. Whilst initial rock art research was largely based on the observation of the motifs, these were somewhat relegated after the introduction of landscape archaeology, because people were then more interested in the landscape and trying to find the context for the rock art, which was quite difficult anyway. And recently, it has become obvious that we have to bring in the detailed analysis of the motifs back into our approaches, especially since the introduction of digital recording techniques, because they can provide us with really valuable information. This is this analysis, so the motif analysis, is a very complex part of our methodology, of the work that we are doing, given the extensive motif variation that we have, and also obviously the number of motifs that we're dealing with, if you consider that we're looking at them individually. So to do this, we adopted the categorical system from previous studies, and we adapted it to the scope of our project. So in total, we have 13 main categories of motifs, which you can see on the left side of the table. And each of these categories is subdivided into attributes, depending on the variations that we identify for each of them. So for example, if you look at the category of gapped rings, you will see that the circles are not just gapped, or not simply gapped rings, but they can be gapped with or without central cut marks. They can have extended legs. They can have they can converge with the radials, which is the little line in the middle. They can be open on one side and closed on the other. The edges of the rings can converge into each other. So there's a lot of variation here. And these are very small details in the making process of Atlantic rock art that demonstrate just how consistent this tradition is. They tell us that the cup and rings are not just simple cup and rings, but they are filled with nuance. They also tell us that we are not dealing with a random copy of the motifs from rock to rock, but instead we're dealing with a tradition that was intentionally taught and passed on from artist to artist in every little detail. And so this typological scheme is also crucial to establish relationships with other regions across Scotland and even wider Atlantic Europe, since we have identified these very fine specialized motifs repeated in other regions. So it also informs us about regional preferences, because they are not all used equally. So in some areas we will see a predominance of some of these motifs, and in others there are other types that were preferred and used more systematically. So on this graph to the left, you can see that the majority of motifs recorded in Kilmartin fall within the category of cup marks. And this is not surprising, since that cup marks are effectively the base of Atlantic rock art. There are very few motifs that do not include a cup mark within this tradition. And this category, we account not only for simple cup marks, but also cup marks used in a variety of combinations, such as conjoined, cup marks on grooves, cup marks connected by lines or dumbbells, cup marks within circles, which are different from the typical cup and ring marks, cup marks between rings on rings. So there was a variety of ways in which the cup marks were being used, and this is what we account for in this large category of cup marks. The second most popular category is that of ring motifs, of course, where the circles are fully carved, so they're complete rings. And the majority of motifs in this category include the typical cup and rings, which can have one single circle to multiple concentric circles, but also accounts for variations such as cup and rings with unusually large central cups, or on the contrary, very small cups or rings that are disproportionately wide in relation to the central cup, or also some ovals and other variations as such. There are also a few gapped rings with a number of very special variations. We have multiple types of radials as well that we're looking at. This is the, which color is it? The radial, so the dark blue. You can see that there's also lots of variations in terms of radials that we are also accounting for. So in essence, this is a very detailed study of the typology of motifs that were being used then, and that are providing us with a lot of information and a lot of detail into how the motifs were used and how we can use them as well to connect them with other regions. So if you look at the table on the right side, I selected some of these special motifs that are not your common cup and ring, that is more kind of widespread, and where you can find them. So these are, for instance, these satellite cups, which are cups on the rings. You can find them obviously in Kilmartin, and then you find them also in Angus, Bute, Dumfries and Galloway, Dumbartonshire and Western Isles. So the gapped and complete rings, for instance, you find them obviously in Kilmartin, but also in other regions. So this is just to show you where Kilmartin is sharing the type of motifs that we are documenting here. What does not fit in this typology is the newly found deer carvings of DUNCHRAIGAIG, which we will obviously have to mention. This exceptional find was revealed to us last year by Hamish Fenton, who discovered the animal carvings years ago, and he identified the grooves while he was looking at the underside of the capstone of this cairn with a torch. And then he produced a 3D model that confirmed his suspicions that he was looking at animal carvings. This is truly an amazing discovery. And it really changed the way that we have to look and think about rock art in Kilmartin, but also elsewhere, because there may be more deer around. Obviously, due to COVID, we were not able to visit the site until April this year, so it was a very long wait for us. We were really, really dying to go there. But we were able to conduct some research using a 3D model that was created by Historic Environment Scotland's Digital Documentation and Innovation team, who created this 3D model using structured light scanning. So we were then able to create multiple renders of the 3D model and look at details such as the erosion of the motifs, the characteristics of the representations, the carving technique. And so what you're seeing in your screen is on the top left-hand side, you see the whole underside of the capstone being treated as if it was an aerial photograph. So we asked a colleague to produce this render using LiDAR techniques, and within the red rectangles, you can see the location of the motifs, which are also in detail in the darker images here. And so if you can see it, the top middle image shows the two little deer that are very faint on the rocks, on the rockstone, and well, they're just very, very weathered, and they don't have as much detail as the ones on the bottom, which are obviously the ones that everyone by now knows. So we did all this research through the 3D model, and all was indicating that these carvings were prehistoric, but given the lack of parallels, we were obviously concerned that these animals could have been added later or be later additions to the monument created after the cairn was opened during the excavations in the 19th century. So, however, when we finally managed to visit it, we were very convinced, it was very conclusive that these are effectively prehistoric carvings. The position of the carvings on the capstone could not have been created after the large stone was put in place, because there's just no space between the ground and the stone to carve. And in addition, we were able to also find documentation in our archives, particularly a 19th century or early 20th century photograph that shows the capstone, and it is very clear that the capstone has not been moved. So this was really reassuring when we found it. So this means that the carvings were created before the capstone was used to close the kist, which may have happened around 2100 BC. And considering how eroded they are, it is also possible that they were created even before that, while they were still part of an outcrop and then quarried for this purpose. And obviously, while the deer carvings for this chronology and this context are completely unique in Scotland and elsewhere in Britain and Ireland as well, Kilmartin is obviously known for the carvings of axe heads in the kists of many of its monuments, and this is also a relatively unique phenomenon in Britain and Ireland, with only a few other known examples. And there is a new journal article on this by Aaron Watson and Richard Bradley, which is definitely worth reading, because it reassesses this these carvings in these monuments. So the archaeological record shows that from 4,300 to 4,000 and 4,000 to 3,900 BC, there were significant changes beginning to occur in Kilmartin, with the introduction of a new range of monuments such as cursuses and chamber tombs, but also practices and traditions and other beliefs. And some researchers believe that these changes happened due to contacts with people coming particularly from France, whilst others argue that these innovations were developed by local people. So I'm just putting out that chronology out. So the rock art in Kilmartin was probably created at the time when a new way of life was introduced, now based on the management of domesticated plants and animals, as opposed to the previous hunter-gatherer fishing economy. In fact, Andrew Jones and Richard Tipping's environmental studies from Torvlaren referred changing vegetation, especially near the valley floor. And from 3,900 BC, they say that woodland began to decline and human activities intensified, probably due to settlement. And there is also evidence of barley growing from 3,400 BC and wheat 200 years later. And the authors describe this as a completely managed landscape where oak trees were encouraged to grow selectively from 2,980 until 2,400 Cal BC, when the trees were felled. So this means that people were transforming the landscape and adapting it to their new needs. So these events are roughly coincidental with the construction of some of Kilmartin's monuments, such as the Timber Circle and the Avenue at Upper Largy. So there's a lot of activity going on. The rock art probably reaches a peak of production during the late Neolithic, so between 3,000 and 2,450 BC, and the Chalcolithic, 2,450 till 2,200 roughly. And at this point, we're not sure if the creation of rock art ceased in the landscape, but we see a new phenomenon emerging, with the carvings being reused in early Bronze Age burial contexts. We don't know exactly why the way people related to the rock art changed so dramatically, moving it from an open landscape setting to the darkness of the burial chambers, but it could be related to social transformations resulting from contact with continental populations coming into Britain at this time, or ongoing, but which intensified at this time, and which also brought in the well-known beaker pottery. So there are many evidences that suggest that Kilmartin and the wider region of Argyll were connected to other parts of Scotland and Ireland, and also other regions of Europe since the Neolithic. So on one hand, we have the Clyde cairn type of Nederlargy, chambered cairn type of Nederlargy South, which was also, which we also know other examples in other parts of the country. We also have specific types of Neolithic pottery that are known to in other parts of Europe, such as France. We have presence of alpine jadeite axes, which indicate that the local populations were in contact with other communities and they were exchanging goods and practices and ideas. And so around 2500, the archaeological record suggests that these connections intensified, and this is something that has been lately reinforced by recent genetic studies that point at these intense movements of people who arrived in Britain at this time, bringing with them a number of novelties, as including, obviously, as I mentioned, the beaker pottery. And these are kind of vessels that were often used in funerary contexts. And in fact, Argyll has two of the earliest examples of beaker-associated graves in Britain, at Sorresdale on Col and at Upper Largy in Kilmartin Glen. And in fact, the individual buried on Col has been analyzed for DNA, and these analyses have confirmed that the genetic ancestry of this individual lies actually in the continent instead of Britain. So, in addition to all this, Kilmartin Glen was also a strategic point controlling the flow of metal coming from Ireland to other parts of Scotland and northern England from around 2200 BC. And this is really important because at this point, copper started being alloyed with tin to make bronze. And so Kilmartin was almost controlling the entry of this metal. And so there was a lot of wealth coming through, which could perhaps justify the existence of so many round cairns in the region, and many of which rich in engraved goods, including Irish and Yorkshire style food vessels, which incidentally we also find in DUNCHRAIGAIG cairn. Oops, I think, yeah, it's too much. So in practical terms for the rock art, what does this mean? Kilmartin fits really well with the concept of Atlantic rock art, in which a grammar of mostly circular designs was created on horizontal or gently sloping, often flush with the ground boulders and outcrops located in wide open landscapes. And this characterization works for every of the regions that you can see in this slide. There are many elements that are shared between Kilmartin and the prehistoric rock art of Scotland more widely, which are also shared with distant regions across Atlantic Europe. The similarities go beyond the style of the carvings, but are also evident in the way that the motifs were used and created, suggesting a universal understanding of this tradition of rock art. The identification of some of these special motifs that I mentioned earlier, and which are repeated in all of these regions, testify for a network of connections that enabled the transmission of this idea, which was adopted and implemented locally by a number of communities across Europe, and which probably traveled with all the artifacts and the people that were also bringing these other things that I've just mentioned across the sea. So clearly there's something very special about this practice and the rock art, which was repeated exhaustively across large territories. However, we also identify differences, even if very faint, in the way that this tradition was applied in the different regions. This is why a detailed study of the different scales of the rock art, like the one that we're developing, is so important, because otherwise some of these differences would probably not be noticed, or if we weren't looking with enough detail, we would not be able to find them. And they are representative of the different communities that lived in Western Europe at this time. So although they may have exchanged goods and used similar artifacts and have identical practices, they had their own identity as well, which is demonstrated in the regional variations that we have been identifying in the rock art. And this may well be one of the reasons why in Iberia the circular motifs of Atlantic rock art were carved alongside depictions of animals, many of which were deer. And perhaps these depictions could have been the inspiration for DUNCHRAIGAIG stags. It's something that we are currently looking into. Oh, and here they are. And thank you so much for listening. I think that that's all we have to say for today.